If you've ever felt like you're doing everything right with money and still falling behind, this video is for you. If money were really the problem, most people watching this wouldn't feel stuck. Think about it. You're probably not reckless with money. You're not blowing it all on one bad decision. You're not ignoring your bills or pretending numbers don't exist. You show up. You try to be responsible. And yet, no matter how hard you push, money never seems to create real breathing room. It's always there, always moving, always demanding attention, but never actually working for you. It feels like you're doing everything you're supposed to do, following the rules, making the right choices, and still nothing clicks. That's where the frustration comes from, and most people internalize that frustration. They assume they must be missing something, that they're not disciplined enough, not focused enough, not smart enough. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If money was just about effort, intelligence, or self-control, you would already be ahead by now. The fact that you're not isn't a personal failure. It's a signal that the game you were taught to play is fundamentally flawed. Most people measure financial success using surface-level markers, paying bills on time, avoiding obvious debt, having a rough idea of where their money goes. And if those boxes are checked, they assume they're doing fine. But that belief is dangerous, because you can look responsible while your future quietly shrinks. You can earn more every year and still feel just as tight. You can understand the concepts and still never feel in control. That gap between effort and outcome is where people get stuck for years, sometimes decades, without knowing why. What's happening beneath the surface isn't talked about enough. There's an illusion at play, a financial competence illusion. It's the belief that because nothing is breaking down, because you're surviving, because life feels manageable, you must be handling money well. But surviving is not the same as building. Stability is not progress. And knowledge is not leverage. This illusion is powerful because it feels reasonable. It feels mature. It feels safe. And that's exactly why it keeps people trapped in the same financial position for most of their lives. Here's the part almost no one realizes early enough. Money does not respond to how much you care. It doesn't respond to how hard you try. And it definitely doesn't respond to how much information you consume. Money responds to structure, to defaults, to patterns, to decisions that happen automatically, without negotiation or emotion. And if you never consciously designed those decisions, something else did. Your environment, your stress, your habits, your need for short-term relief. None of that makes you irresponsible. It makes you human. Money doesn't slowly disappear because of one big mistake. It doesn't vanish because you bought the wrong thing once. It moves exactly where it's told to move. Quietly, repeatedly, predictably. Most people never notice the commands they're giving their money because those commands don't feel like decisions. They feel normal, familiar, harmless, but over time, they shape your entire financial future. And until you learn how to see those invisible instructions clearly, motivation will never be enough. In the next part, we're going to uncover where money actually leaks from people's lives. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, silent ones that feel insignificant until years have passed. Most people believe their financial problem is income. That if they just earned a little more, everything would finally stabilize. And that belief makes sense, because more money does solve short-term pressure. It covers emergencies. It reduces anxiety. It gives you options. But here's what almost no one talks about. For the majority of people, income doesn't fix the problem. It hides it. Because if the structure underneath is broken, more money doesn't change the direction. It just increases the speed. That's why you see the same pattern repeat over and over. Someone gets a raise. Someone switches jobs. Someone starts making more than they ever have before. And for a few months, life feels lighter. Bills feel smaller. Saving feels possible. There's optimism, but slowly, almost invisibly, the pressure comes back. Not because they failed, but because the system running their money never changed. It simply adjusted to absorb the extra income. This is where most people misunderstand how money actually behaves. They treat it like a score, like something you accumulate and protect. But money isn't static. It's dynamic. It flows. It reacts. And if you don't deliberately decide where it goes first, it will always be claimed by whatever screams the loudest. Convenience, comfort, social expectations. Lifestyle upgrades that feel justified because you earned them. None of those choices feel irresponsible in isolation. That's what makes them so dangerous. The real issue isn't spending too much or saving too little. It's sequence. It's the order in which decisions are made. Most people let life make the first move with their money. Rent gets paid, subscriptions renew, lifestyle locks in, commitments stack up. And only after everything else is satisfied do they ask what's left for the future. At that point, the answer is usually disappointing. Not because there wasn't enough money, but because there was no priority. And here's the part that's hard to accept. This pattern isn't accidental. It's reinforced everywhere. Society rewards visible consumption. It normalizes debt. It frames saving as optional and investing as risky. You're taught how to earn money, how to spend money, and how to borrow money, but almost never how to control it. So people assume control means restraint, saying no, cutting back, being disciplined. But discipline without structure eventually fails, every time. What actually keeps people stuck is emotional fatigue, constant decision-making, negotiating with yourself every month, telling yourself you'll do better next time. That cycle drains energy, and when energy runs out, habits win. Not bad habits, familiar ones, the ones that feel safe, the ones that don't require thought. Over time, those habits become invisible rules that govern your financial life. Rules you didn't consciously choose, but still obey. Most people never stop to ask a critical question. Who gets paid first in my life? Is it my future, or is it everything else? Because until that question is answered honestly, nothing changes. You can budget, you can track expenses, you can watch videos and read books, but if your money is still reacting instead of being directed, you're just managing decline more neatly. In the next part, we're going to expose the first silent habit that locks people into this cycle. Not the obvious ones everyone talks about, but the foundational behavior that determines whether money ever starts working for you or always feels one step ahead. There is an invisible rule that quietly dictates most people's financial outcomes, and almost no one is aware they're following it. This rule doesn't come from a textbook, a finance class, or even from bad advice. It comes from how modern life is designed. And once you understand it, a lot of your past decisions will suddenly make sense. The rule is simple. Money flows by default, not by intention. Most people don't actively decide how their money should behave. They let systems decide for them. Paychecks arrive, bills are due, subscriptions renew, expenses repeat, and whatever is left over is treated as the result of their financial behavior. But that leftover number is not a plan, it's a byproduct. And by the time you see it, all the important decisions have already been made. This is why so many people feel like they earn decent money, yet never feel ahead. Their income is constantly reacting instead of leading. Every month becomes a replay of the last one. The same obligations, the same patterns, the same stress points. And because nothing feels obviously broken, nothing gets questioned. What makes this especially dangerous is that the system rewards short-term comfort. Convenience is marketed as freedom. Monthly payments are framed as affordability. Automation is used to make spending effortless, not to make progress inevitable. So the environment gently nudges you toward decisions that feel good now, but quietly reduce your future options. Over time, this creates a financial life that is optimized for maintenance, not growth. You're very good at sustaining what you already have, but terrible at building toward what you want. And the more complex your life becomes, the harder it feels to change anything without disrupting everything. This is why advice like just save more or just invest earlier often fails in practice. Those suggestions assume that money is neutral and flexible. But in reality, money is already assigned a job the moment it enters your account. Rent has a claim on it. Lifestyle has a claim on it. Past decisions have a claim on it. By the time you try to redirect it, you're negotiating with commitments you've already normalized. There's also a deeper psychological layer here. When money is handled passively, it creates the illusion that outcomes are external. People start saying things like, "I'm just bad with money," or "I never seem to get ahead," as if this is a personality trait rather than a system problem. This belief is incredibly disempowering because it shifts responsibility away from structure and toward identity. And once money becomes tied to identity, change feels threatening. Adjusting spending doesn't feel like an optimization, it feels like a downgrade. Saving more doesn't feel strategic, it feels restrictive. Investing doesn't feel exciting, it feels risky. Every smart move feels emotionally expensive because it challenges the version of normal you've grown used to. This is also where comparison quietly makes things worse. You're not just managing your own finances, you're managing them in a social environment. You see how others live, what they buy, how they talk about money, and even if you know intellectually that comparison is dangerous, emotionally it still influences your baseline. Your version of enough gets inflated without you noticing. So now you have a system where money flows automatically, expectations rise gradually, and future goals are constantly postponed in favor of present stability. Not because you don't care about the future, but because the present keeps demanding attention. And attention is a finite resource. Here's the key insight most people miss. Financial progress doesn't start with better decisions. It starts with better defaults. If your financial life relies on constant self-control, you will eventually fail. Not because you're weak, but because no one can out-discipline a poorly designed system forever. Until the flow of money is intentionally structured, everything else remains fragile. Goals feel motivational but unrealistic. Plans look good on paper but collapse under pressure. And every year that passes reinforces the belief that progress is harder than it actually needs to be. In the next act, we're going to talk about the first real shift that breaks this cycle. Not a tip, not a hack, but a fundamental change in how money is positioned in your life. One that turns progress from something you try to do into something that happens automatically. Once you accept that willpower is not the solution, everything changes. Because now the question stops being, how do I try harder? And becomes, how do I remove friction from doing the right thing and add friction to doing the wrong thing? This is where most financial advice gets things backward. People are taught to fight their behavior instead of designing around it. But behavior is predictable. Humans are wired to choose what's easy, what's familiar, and what feels safe in the moment. So instead of relying on discipline, the smartest move is to redesign the environment so that progress happens by default. This starts with a fundamental reordering of priorities. Not in your head, but in your accounts. Most people organize their money around spending first and saving later. Income comes in, life happens, and whatever survives is meant to build the future. But this approach guarantees inconsistency. The future only gets funded if the present behaves. The shift is simple, but uncomfortable at first. The future must be paid before the present gets access to the rest. Not emotionally, structurally. This means that the moment income arrives, a portion of it is immediately redirected toward long-term goals before lifestyle has a chance to claim it. Not because you're being strict, but because you're being honest about how money actually works. What's powerful about this isn't the percentage or the number. It's the sequence. Sequence determines outcome. When the future is funded first, everything else adjusts around it. Spending becomes more intentional. Choices become clearer. Trade-offs become visible. And suddenly, progress is no longer something you hope for at the end of the month. It's something that already happened. This also changes how you experience saving and investing. Instead of feeling like deprivation, it feels like completion. The important work is already done. What's left is simply allocation. This mental shift dramatically reduces stress because you're no longer negotiating with yourself every time you want to spend. The decision was made once ahead of time. But this only works if the system is protected from interference. One of the biggest reasons people sabotage their own plans is accessibility. When money meant for the future sits in the same account as money meant for today, it becomes vulnerable. Convenience turns into temptation, and temptation turns into rationalization. Separating money by purpose isn't about complexity, it's about clarity. Different accounts for different jobs create psychological boundaries. When future-focused money is slightly harder to access, it stops feeling like an option. And when present-focused money has limits, it encourages conscious choice instead of autopilot behavior. This is also where automation becomes a weapon for progress instead of a tool for consumption. Automation isn't just about convenience. It's about removing emotion from repetition. When saving, investing, and essential payments happen automatically, they no longer compete for attention. They happen whether motivation is high or low, whether life is calm or chaotic. And here's the part most people don't expect. Once the system is set up correctly, you don't feel restricted, you feel free. Because freedom isn't about having access to everything. It's about knowing your future is being taken care of without constant effort. This is the moment where people realized they don't need to track every dollar or obsess over every purchase. They need alignment, not micromanagement. A system that reflects their priorities and enforces them quietly, consistently, and without negotiation. In the next act, we're going to address the mindset shift that makes this system sustainable long-term. Because structure alone isn't enough. To keep moving forward year after year, the way you think about time, gratification, and progress has to evolve as well. There is one variable that quietly determines financial outcomes more than income, intelligence, or even strategy. And yet it's the one most people consistently underestimate. Not because they don't understand it intellectually, but because they don't feel it emotionally. That variable is time. Time is deceptive. In the short term, it feels almost irrelevant. A month passes quickly. A year doesn't feel dramatically different from the one before it. Progress appears slow, sometimes invisible. And because the human brain is wired to respond to immediate feedback, anything that doesn't show results right away gets deprioritized. This is why so many people delay starting. They tell themselves they'll invest later, save later, optimize later, when the numbers are bigger or when life is calmer. What they're really saying is that they're waiting for certainty, but certainty never arrives. And time keeps moving regardless. What most people miss is that compounding doesn't reward intensity. It rewards consistency over long periods. Small, repeated actions executed early outperform large, perfect actions executed late. But this logic directly conflicts with how we're taught to think about progress. We're conditioned to believe that effort should produce visible results quickly. When it doesn't, we assume something isn't working. Financial progress operates on a delayed feedback loop. The actions you take today rarely change your life tomorrow. They change the slope of your trajectory. And trajectories only become obvious with distance. This is why people often underestimate how powerful their current decisions are and overestimate how much they'll be able to catch up later. There's also a psychological trap here. When the payoff is far away, the cost feels more real than the benefit. Seeing money leave your account today feels concrete. Imagining freedom years from now feels abstract. So the brain naturally favors the present. Not because it's irrational, but because it's trying to reduce uncertainty. To break this pattern, you have to stop framing long-term decisions as sacrifices. Sacrifice implies loss, and the brain resists loss. Instead, these decisions have to be reframed as transfers. You're not giving something up. You're relocating value from your present self to your future self. And your future self is not a stranger. It's you, just with more perspective and fewer options to course correct. This is why people who build real wealth often don't feel like they're constantly depriving themselves. They've trained themselves to see delayed gratification as a form of ownership. Every action they take today quietly buys them more optionality later, more flexibility, more control over their time, more ability to say no. Visualization plays a critical role here, but not in a motivational sense, not as a vague dream of success. Instead, it's about making the future concrete enough that it competes with the present. When the future feels real, present decisions become easier. You're no longer choosing between something now and nothing later. You're choosing between two real outcomes. This also explains why starting small is so powerful. Small actions feel manageable. They don't trigger fear or resistance. And once they're in motion, they create momentum. Momentum reduces friction. Friction reduction increases consistency. And consistency is what allows time to do its work. The biggest mistake people make is waiting to feel ready. Readiness is not a prerequisite for progress. Action is. Clarity follows movement, not the other way around. Every month you delay, starting doesn't just postpone results. It shortens the window where compounding can work in your favor. And here's the uncomfortable part. Time doesn't punish inaction immediately. It waits. It compounds consequences quietly, which is why the cost of delay often only becomes visible years later. When options feel limited and catching up requires far more effort than starting would have. The good news is that the same force works in your favor the moment you align your actions with it. Once time is on your side, progress stops feeling fragile. You're no longer racing against the clock. You're working with it. In the next act, we're going to talk about something that either accelerates or completely sabotages this process: identity and environment. Because even the best system and the best understanding of time can collapse if your surroundings constantly pull you in the opposite direction. Even with the right system and a long-term mindset, most people still struggle to move forward. Not because they lack knowledge, but because they are fighting something much harder to see: their environment and the identity they've quietly built inside it. Money decisions are rarely made in isolation. They're shaped by what feels normal around you. How people live, how they talk, what they celebrate, what they dismiss. Over time, these signals form an internal standard for what is acceptable, desirable, and reasonable. And once that standard is set, deviating from it feels uncomfortable, even when you know it's the right move. This is why financial change often feels socially risky. Spending less doesn't just feel like a practical decision. It can feel like a practical decision. It can feel like a practical decision. It can feel like a statement. Sales often feels socially risky. Investing long-term instead of upgrading your lifestyle can feel like falling behind. Saying no to certain experiences can feel like opting out of the group. The fear isn't about money, it's about belonging. Identity plays a massive role here. Most people don't think of themselves as someone who builds wealth. They think of themselves as someone who manages bills, pays rent, and tries to stay afloat. That identity dictates behavior. And behavior reinforces identity in a feedback loop that's hard to break. If your identity is tied to being responsible, comfortable, or generous in visible ways, then certain financial moves will feel off limits, not logically, but emotionally. You may know that skipping an upgrade or delaying gratification makes sense, but it clashes with who you believe you are. And when identity is threatened, the brain resists change. This is why environment matters more than motivation. You can understand all the principles, but if your surroundings constantly reinforce short-term thinking, progress becomes exhausting. Every decision requires friction. Every choice feels like swimming upstream. Over time, even strong systems erode under constant pressure. There's also a subtle comparison trap at play. You're not comparing your internal reality to others' internal reality. You're comparing your behind the scenes to their highlights, their visible spending, their apparent ease, their milestones. And without realizing it, you adjust your behavior to avoid feeling less than, even if that adjustment moves you further away from your own goals. To break this pattern, identity has to shift before behavior can fully stabilize. You don't need to become someone else. You need to become more deliberate about the role money plays in your life. Instead of seeing financial restraint as limitation, it has to become a signal of alignment. Instead of seeing long-term thinking as boring, it has to become a marker of independence. This doesn't happen overnight. Identity changes through evidence. Every small action that aligns with your future reinforces a new self-image. Someone who plans, someone who thinks ahead, someone who values flexibility over appearances. Over time, these actions stack, and the discomfort fades. Environment can also be redesigned, not by cutting everyone off or living in isolation, but by being selective about influence. This might mean consuming less content that glorifies lifestyle inflation, spending more time around people who talk openly about goals instead of just purchases, or simply creating physical and digital spaces that reduce exposure to impulsive triggers. The goal isn't to escape society. It's to stop letting default norms dictate your financial behavior. Once you do that, you gain an incredible advantage. You stop reacting, you start choosing, and choice is where real freedom begins. In the next act, we're going to move into leverage. Not in the abstract sense, but in the most practical way possible. Because once your system, mindset, and identity are aligned, the fastest way forward isn't cutting more. It's expanding intelligently through skills, income, and asymmetric opportunities. There's a hard ceiling to how far discipline alone can take you. You can optimize your spending, build strong systems, and think long-term. But eventually, progress slows if income stays fixed. This is where many people get frustrated. They do everything right and still feel constrained. Not because they failed, but because they're playing a game with limited upside. Saving is defensive. It protects what you already have. But growth comes from expansion. And the most overlooked form of expansion isn't working more hours. It's increasing the value of your time through skills. Skills create asymmetric upside. They don't just add income once, they compound earning power over years. One skill can open doors to better roles, higher leverage opportunities, or entirely new income streams. And unlike money in an account, skills can't be inflated away or taken from you. The mistake people often make here is confusing learning with progress. Consuming information feels productive, but without implementation, it doesn't change outcomes. The goal isn't to know more, it's to earn more, create more, or free up time in ways that directly support your long-term plan. This is why intentional learning matters. Not every skill is worth your time or money. The most valuable skills sit at the intersection of demand, leverage, and personal fit. Skills that solve real problems. Skills that scale beyond your direct effort. Skills that increase optionality instead of locking you into more complexity. There's also a mental shift required to see skill building as an investment rather than an expense. Spending on learning can feel uncomfortable because the return isn't guaranteed or immediate. But that discomfort is often a signal that you're stepping outside short-term thinking. The key is clarity. If you can explain how a skill connects to future value, it stops being consumption and starts being strategy. This doesn't mean chasing every trend or buying endless courses. In fact, restraint is critical. Progress comes from depth, not accumulation. One well-chosen skill developed consistently will outperform 10 half-finished attempts. Focus creates leverage. Scatter creates noise. Income expansion also changes how the rest of the system feels. When earning potential grows, saving becomes easier. Investing feels less constrained. Decisions carry less emotional weight. You're no longer relying on perfect discipline to make progress. You're creating margin, and margin is the real goal. Margin in time, margin in money, margin in mental energy. It's what allows you to make better decisions under pressure. It's what gives you room to adapt when life changes. It's what turns financial stability into financial freedom. The important thing is sequencing. Expansion only works when the foundation is solid. Without structure, higher income just accelerates old patterns. With structure, it accelerates progress. The same skill, the same opportunity, the same raise can produce completely different outcomes depending on the system it feeds into. This is why people with strong fundamentals can move fast without losing control. They don't feel guilty spending on growth because it's integrated into their plan. They don't feel pressure to show results immediately because they understand long-term leverage. In the final act, we're going to integrate everything: system, time, identity, and expansion. Not as separate ideas, but as one coherent way of thinking about money. Because real financial literacy isn't about tactics. It's about building a life where money supports your priorities instead of competing with them. At this point, you can probably feel the shift, not just in how you think about money, but in how you see your own behavior. What once felt confusing now looks predictable. What once felt like a personal flaw now looks like a system that was never designed in your favor. This is what real financial literacy feels like. It's not about knowing more formulas or memorizing rules. It's about understanding the forces that shape your decisions and choosing to design around them instead of fighting them. When structure comes first, effort becomes lighter. When time is respected, pressure decreases. When identity aligns with intention, consistency stops feeling forced. And when growth is approached through skills and leverage, the future stops feeling fragile. The most important realization is this: nothing you've learned requires perfection. Progress doesn't come from dramatic overhauls. It comes from small, intentional shifts that compound quietly. The kind of shifts that don't impress anyone immediately, but completely change your trajectory over years. You don't need to earn more than everyone else. You don't need to be extreme. You don't need to deprive yourself or chase some ideal version of success. You just need alignment. Money flowing toward what actually matters. Systems that protect your future without constant effort. A mindset that values optionality over appearances. Once those pieces are in place, decisions get simpler. Spending becomes intentional instead of emotional. Saving and investing feel like maintenance, not sacrifice. Learning feels purposeful, not random. And money stops being a source of anxiety and becomes a quiet support system in the background of your life. This is also where patience becomes a competitive advantage. In a world obsessed with speed, those who can think long-term stand out, not because they rush ahead, but because they don't panic, overreact, or abandon the plan when results aren't immediate. They trust the process because they understand it. And maybe the most powerful shift of all is how you relate to your future self. You stop treating the future as a problem to deal with later and start treating it as a responsibility you honor today. Every aligned decision becomes an act of respect for who you're becoming. If you're watching this and realizing that some of your habits no longer make sense, that's a good sign. It means you're evolving. It means you're ready to move from reacting to designing, from hoping things work out to quietly making sure they do. The goal was never to control every dollar. The goal was to build a life where money supports your values, your time, and your freedom. And once you see money this way, there's no going back. From here, the path is simple. Not easy, but clear. And clarity, more than motivation, is what changes everything.